St George's Day is the one day of the year where we're allowed to celebrate being English and to celebrate England's achievements, which is why it's so difficult for the Labour Party and for Keir Starmer to say anything about it, because of course they hate the English people and they hate England. They're not very patriotic. He was saying, we need to reclaim this flag, but I would say we, the English people, need to reclaim it from the far left who seek to present the flag as being racist or far right when it isn't.
There's more than a 5-fold increase in attendance at church by young men in this country. There's a sense that there is a rival challenge to our civilization, most salient in the form of Islam, which makes no bones whatsoever about making those strong claims about man and his relationship to God.
They want to create, Reform UK wants to create a Minister of Deportations, which of course sounds very encouraging. And this would be incorporated into the Home Office, which sounds less encouraging, but it comes on the back of an understanding from Reform UK that the Home Office is broken. As we've said here, they are a fifth column in many ways, working against the interests of the British nation, and therefore you need to have a proper reform of the Home Office and also ensure that those people running this Ministry of Deportation are actually very sound individuals who are capable.
Hello and welcome to Newspeak. I'm Peter Whittle, and as usual I'm thoroughly pleased to be joined by our senior fellow Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, royal historian too, Amy Gallagher of This Manor, and joining us today, obviously, Harrison Pitt from Deprogrammed and also senior editor still.
Contributing editor, yes. This arcana doesn't mean much to the viewers, but yes, contributing editor at the
European Conservative, absolutely. Before we look at the particular week's events, just a few notices. These are regular now, which is an incredibly good sign of our growing movement. We have, as you probably know already, our first literary festival coming up in May. It's almost sold out. It's coming up in London on May the 23rd, May the 24th. This is the first time we've done something like this. We've got great names. And on the Friday in particular, we have Matthew Goodwin and Lionel Shriver. And that's on our Friday session in the evening. Now, there are still tickets left for that one. Please, if you'd like to come along, do get in touch. Actually, perhaps you can tell me, Rafe, what should people get in touch with?
So they go to our website. There'll be a link to purchase tickets.
Website to link. Then on the Saturday, we have another 6 or 7 sessions, again, with people like Alison Pearson from The Telegraph. This is a great 2-day event we're doing, actually, and it's going to become an annual one, I'm pleased to say. So if you would like to get a ticket, especially for the Friday, because there are a few more left for those, then please do get in touch. Go to our website. Alongside that, Rafe, we've got quite a few locals events coming up.
Yes, a veritable cornucopia of NCF locals events coming up. So if you live in or around any of these towns, please do get in touch. On April the 29th, there'll be a meetup in Southampton. Also on the 29th, in Newcastle, there'll be an event with our very own Dr. Philip Kiszely, who is also the national organiser of NCF locals. Then on April the 30th, in Cambridge, we're going to be launching a brand new NCF Locals branch. So anyone in Cambridge or Anglia, do come along to that. And I will be there as well as Dr. Philip Kiszely. So if you would like to come and say hello, please do. May the 1st in Southend, an event with Mark Beechill. 4th of May in Birmingham, informal social. 8th of May in London, we'll have the NCF Locals Book Club first event. So again, if you enjoy literary events, we've got not only our literary festival, but in London, for local members, there will be a book club event taking place. On the 13th in Salisbury, the 20th of May in Newcastle and in Canterbury, 28th in Brighton, an event with Philip Kiszely, and rounding up May will be in Carlisle on the 31st. All events are free of charge. And to attend, please email locals@newcultureforum.org.uk.
Thanks so much, Rafe. It's all over the place, aren't we? I mean, it's going to be international, hopefully soon. I mean, I think we've got international members, haven't we now?
Well, we've had interest from Canada and from Ireland are setting up branches. So who knows what's possible.
Yes, it's wonderful. Amy, this week we had St George's Day, right? for many of us in the country, it's a big deal, but for a lot of other people, it might even have just slipped under the radar. But of course, Keir Starmer made something of it, didn't he?
Yeah, well, obviously, St George's Day is the one day of the year where we're allowed to celebrate being English and to celebrate England's achievements, which is why it's so difficult for the Labour Party and for Keir Starmer to say anything about it, because, of course, they hate the English people and they hate England. They're not very patriotic. They hate nationalism. So Keir Starmer had to kind of, through gritted teeth, make signals about, St George's Day, but he couldn't quite stop himself from having a dig at the kind of phantom of the far right and saying how we need to reclaim the flag from the far right and those who, I think he said, seek to sow division, like those that he referenced the Southport riot. So he was saying how people were using the flag to using it, kind of weaponising it. And yeah, I mean, obviously he is the one causing division because he's taking a day that should unite everyone and using it to make a political point. And then he's talking about the importance of everybody coming together, but not those people that have the wrong opinions that we don't like, who were quite rightly, in many instances, angry about 3 girls being murdered. That's never mentioned when he talks about the Southport riots. It's always the response to Southport. It's never why there was that response. So it's just really insulting. And I mean, this goes back for a long time in the Labour Party, a hatred of kind of the English flag and St George's Day. We had, not that long ago, it was Emily Thornberry who tweeted that picture of the England flag outside somebody's house, just mocking
That's right, in Rochester.
Yeah, yes. just as though that picture is enough just to sneer at somebody for just simply having the England flag. Last year, Sadiq Khan, during the Euros, he banned taxi drivers from flying the England flag. And you'll know that, this is never done to other flags. I mean, we have a kind of rise of lots of other flags in this country, the Palestinian flag, the Hamas flag, the Pakistani flag, the LGBTQ transgender flag. And these flags seem to be able to be waved without criticism. They're not seen as problematic, but it's the England flag. And the irony was, he was saying, we need to reclaim this flag. But I would say we, the English people, need to reclaim it from the far left who seek to present the flag as being racist or far right when it isn't. I think a lot of people would feel nervous about walking along with the England flag because you'd worry that you would be given a kind of a non-crime hate incident or told you're a racist or something like that. And that has come from the left. So I would say we need to reclaim the flag, if anybody needs to reclaim the flag. And it was just a rather depressing and demoralising statement from Keir Starmer that just shows you that he just keeps mentioning this far right, and it's just so infuriating, particularly given how with Southport we've seen so much corruption and lies around it. The fact that he keeps bringing it up is so insulting. It's so insulting to the girls that were murdered and all the people that were affected by it that it keeps being used to score political points, particularly on St George's Day. So.
Yes, I think the point about this argument, of reclaiming it, they've been using this for years, I mean, and also I think for that matter, probably a few Tories as well, like Cameron would have said this. It's a total straw man argument, it seems to me, because the people who's saying that, like Starmer this week, don't give a damn about the flag anyway. They just don't like it anyway. What are they so worried about, Do you think as well, what struck me, Harrison, was that when he talked about, England, and from what I gather, there's certain sort of examples that were used were very kind of milk-soppy, weren't they? Queuing and tea and things like this. This is what we come down to.
Yeah, the basic idea is that English identity can only be morally and socially acceptable if it is as thin and as undemanding and as inclusive as possible.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, not... that cannot be the case with things like flags, because it is in the nature of flags that they're expressive of an identity that is particular by its very nature. And therefore it cannot be, unless it's something like the United Nations, I suppose, it cannot be necessarily universal in its reach. And everyone understands this with the Indian flag. If I'd turned up to some of those Indian Independence Day celebrations that often take place in our most ghettoized towns and cities and started sort of, brandishing myself in the Indian flag and trying to present myself as some kind of Indian with a plausible claim to celebrating Indian nationalism, I'd get some strange looks from the crowd, I should think. And Keir Starmer would presumably, or people like Keir Starmer would presumably accuse me of engaging in a form of identity theft. I mean, that is what cultural appropriation means. It's the idea that you're staking a claim to something that is not, properly speaking, yours culturally. And what this is really indicative of, it's not just that they dislike nationalism, although I'm not saying you're wrong, but just to supplement that, they dislike forms of nationalism as exhibited by majority white European countries. In other contexts, it's considered completely the done thing, because there's this idea that, well, these people have embattled histories of oppression. These are sort of the underdog forms of nationalism, and so we can celebrate these. You can celebrate Irish nationalism to some extent, although increasingly that's controversial too. You can celebrate Scottish nationalism. You can celebrate Welsh nationalism. You can certainly celebrate Palestinian nationalism. You can certainly celebrate Kashmiri nationalism, Pakistani nationalism, potentially even Indian nationalism. But whenever a majority white European population is staking, not in threatening terms, but just in quite clear terms, an exclusive claim to a particular identity and wanting to revel in that and glory in it, and not just reduce it to sort of biscuit tins and teapots and loving Oasis. That's obviously all part of it, but that's the fruit of their form of identity. It's not the essence of the form of identity. Then all of a sudden it's problematic. And because Keir Starmer is just part of this kind of liberal metropolitan class that sees those forms of nationalism as very threatening to not just to their moral sensibilities, but to their power, he cannot help, when these kinds of occasions come around, to talking out of both sides of his mouth and not seeming very convincing.
Hello. Please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you. I think there was I don't know if you saw it, Rafe, that there was one of these celebrations, very desultory affair, I have to say, in Trafalgar Square, which is organised by the mayor. But again, there was this kind of, actually I would say, throwback, very nostalgic tone to it. It was very much doing the Lambeth Walk, Pearly Kings and Queens. It's particularly depressing because it sort of makes you feel, they say, well, look, let's just give them that. They've lost, so let's be magnanimous. That's how it feels.
Yeah, it's a sob. It's a biscuit tin covered version of what it means to be English. We just did, if people go to our channel, we just did a speech that I gave at our last locals conference where I listed how England made the world. And I list the 10 ways, I think, from the Industrial Revolution to the spread of industrial capitalism, to the English language, to the common law, to the parliamentary system of democracy. Even the American presidential system of democracy has British roots. That sport, no country has done more to codify sport around the world. One of the greatest form of national unity around the world and national identity. Those are great things to champion about England. Instead of that, what do we get? We get Morris dancers. We get beefeaters walking around Trafalgar Square. Or you get what Keir Starmer did, was where he basically invited public services in. St George's Day for Keir Starmer at 10 Downing Street was all about the NHS and the police at a time when public trust in those institutions is at a record low, rather than actually celebrating the fact that no country in the world has had a greater impact on civilization than England in so many ways. And Harrison is quite right, and Amy too. The left hates the nation state, actually. The left is about internationalism. That's the foundation rock of socialism and of communism and of the far left. They hate the nation state, they hate borders, except, of course, in that traditional far-left perspective of the oppressor and the oppressed. So if you're from an oppressed nation, which they now include Scotland and Wales in that, for example, then you're allowed to wave your flag. You wave the saltire, you wave the dragon. It's called progressive nationalism. When the English wave the St George's Cross, it's racist. And just imagine, on our national day for England, you have the Prime Minister of this country mentioning Southport and racism. Of all the things to talk about, he linked it directly with it. I think that's absolutely scurrilous and outrageous. We don't need to reclaim the flag. The flag has always been for England. You just have to go, the quintessential image of England is serene, right? It's the cross of St. George fluttering above a church, an ancient church in an ancient village somewhere, or the flag of St. George next to an English green where people are playing cricket. The English flag has always been part of the English people's lives, and to try to associate it with that is I think, horrific.
Do you think that there's a class element to this too? I mean, I do. I think there's a class element. The England flag always was associated too with football supporters. And is there something is considered to be, that tweet you mentioned, that was a class thing. It wasn't just that someone was displaying it. It was a white van man.
Yeah, and the same with Sadiq Khan's ban on taxi drivers waving the English flag. They were taxi drivers, There is something about them being thugs or kind of being, linking it to the rioters. I think it has a history of kind of being associated with football, as you say. But there is something, I think, that they sneer at working class people's attachment to the country because they see themselves as kind of internationalist, cosmopolitan. That there's something, I don't know, something small about...
Parochial.
Yeah, parochial, exactly, about being attached to your country.
Labour were not always like this. I mean, this internationalism thing. If you go back to Attlee's generation, sorry to sound, it's a cliche, but it's nevertheless true.
Yes.
They would have been horrified by this kind of condescension.
Well, another cliche is it's a national health service for a reason, not an international health service. And so there's an implicit understanding there that the kind of welfare politics that post-war Labour premiers thought was desirable was only practicable within a national framework, because it's only within that national framework that there are the requisite sources of solidarity whereby people are willing to sacrifice. People are willing to sacrifice for their neighbour and indeed for their countrymen in a way that people are just generally, not all people, but most people are less willing to sacrifice for someone that they don't know on the other side of the world. So what old leftist politics used to do is it used to try its best, doesn't mean it got everything correct, but it used to try its best to cooperate and work with the natural sentiments of human beings just as they are, rather than trying to reshape them and change them. And I suppose one of the features of the New Left was that they viewed this sort of national solidarity as potentially a stepping stone on the way to the kind of rapacious fascism that we saw in the 1930s and 40s. And so what the New Left is fundamentally preoccupied, the left that comes into fashion, which is much more metropolitan, much more socially liberal in the 1960s, what they're very preoccupied by is constantly to look around society and to survey it for potential prophylactic signs that fascism might arise in the future. And so Theodor Adorno, in his book The Authoritarian Personality, he would do things like point to the existence of strong father figures in homes. This is just an example, and say, gosh, that is clearly that could be symptomatic of some kind of future fascistic idea. Therefore, in order to make the world Holocaust proof, we need to make sure that the family is destroyed in some way. And many leftists, including the early architects of the European Union, like Jean Monnet, viewed the nation state as similarly something that can never really be admired in a morally neutral way, because it might lead to the kind of rapacious fascism we saw in the 30s and 40s. And so I think that the New Left really just eroded that old Labour tradition. And ever so, you've got some hangovers like Paul Embry and Claire Fox to some extent hanging around, but they're not the dominant strain of left-wing thought at the moment.
But on the positive side, we are seeing a backlash against all of this, and you're seeing a resurgence of pride and Englishness. Traditionally, an Englishman wore his patriotism very lightly. And, he may or may not have believed whether God was an Englishman, but he certainly believed that the English were blessed by God. Cecil Rhodes' famous adage, remember, sir, you are an Englishman and have therefore won first prize in the lottery of life. And so the English didn't mind for generations having their greatest achievements woven up into, the British national fabric. When you're top dog in the world, you don't really care about it. We don't even put our name on our stamps, right? We have our stamps and everybody else's stamps. But suddenly, when Britain ceased to be the great nation, and when you see the Scots and the Welsh and others in being unfairly privileged, for example, in handouts and in financial benefits and everywhere, getting their own parliament, no parliament for England, Labour MPs under Tony Blair were voting on English-only legislation, getting through difficult legislation that the English didn't want it. That sticks in the craw, and it goes against that most fundamentally English value of fair play. It's just not cricket. And that is no coincidence that it's been in that same period that where the Union flag used to be seen at England matches, for example, then you began to see the English flag flying instead of that. St. George's Day cards, the number of those being sent went up in the early 2000s and so forth. So there is this resurgent English nationalist spirit. It's like sort of a bear being baited in an old Southwark pit, and then all those dogs have been attacking it, and it's riled itself, and everyone should be very careful about that, because England actually is the very dominant force within the Union. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of people on the left trying to suppress English nationalism, because they fear that unleashed it will be something they can't tame.
Well, absolutely. You mentioned there, by the way, about football matches. The big turning point, I think, was the 1996. Would it have been the Euros?
European Championship. Yeah.
Quite right. You go back to 1966, it's a sea of Union flags.
Interesting.
Yeah, but then by 1990, so that had already happened, mostly across the St. George. You know? And I mean, I remember my parents themselves, it's interesting you talk about this kind of growth in an English identity. Almost sort of like, well, it was subconscious, it was not meant. They would start calling themselves English. Once they would always have called themselves British, but I just, they was English, and I do now too.
And all the polling shows that it was about 15 years ago, I think it was, for the first time, English people began to identify as English first and British second, whereas traditionally it was only the Scots and the Welsh who would say that they were Scots first and Welsh second. Then the English would always say British first, and then the Ulstermen would be the ones most likely to identify as being British first for obvious reasons. But that's transformed only within the space of 2 decades.
Yes, exactly. I think, you see, what that it comes from was this sense in which something's being lost. Also, that trying to hold on to something that's being lost. But also, if anyone can be British, then nobody's British. That's the thing.
But also, I think it also it goes somewhat back to what Rafe was saying earlier about how England's contributions have, for better or worse, largely for better, been for the world. And so if to some extent English culture has become, through the empire, the universal culture, the kind of the vernacular of the world, like suits, which is 18th century English hunting gear, the common law, parliaments, constitutional monarchy, these sorts of things are global exports now. It becomes much harder for us to see them as quintessentially ours. And maybe that didn't matter so much when these things could be taken for granted and didn't need to be made explicit. But given that we are a second-rate power now and we have lost the empire, it's not surprising that in '66, where we were still going through the process of decolonisation, English people saw fit to throw up the Union flag, and then later on down the line, when that can no longer be taken for granted anymore, you need to lean into that English identity and feel for something because you feel like you're losing something. But it's partly a product of the fact that we had previously been able just to take all of this for granted.
And I would say you're absolutely right about it being globalized, but also everything that you think about as being British, a lot of it has English roots, and the English link to that isn't shared in the same way as, for example, we all know what the Scottish identity is, but you ask an American, for example, about a British person, and they'll have a chap with a bowler hat and a briefcase who's fundamentally an English person. And, you just have to go on Google, and if you Google a Scottish or a Welsh famous inventor or scientist, it will say Scottish inventor or Welsh inventor. You Google an English person, it will say British inventor. So I think this is part of the problem. If you want to, the English need to reclaim as their own all of those things, all of those achievements that they've offered up to become British. Yes. Not meaning that they're no longer British, but clearly and passionately saying, well, actually, these are of English origin.
Actually, it's interesting on that point. Americans always refer to England.
The Queen of England, yeah.
England. Oh, he's going to England. They never say Britain, they say England.
I was going to say, it seems to me as though, I don't know, in the last couple of years, it feels like more and more people are wanting to celebrate St. George's Day. There's even people like, requesting that it should be a bank holiday, because I feel like people do feel like we're losing our national identity more than ever. So I feel like it is being promoted more by some people, which I think is kind of a reaction to that.
Yes. You mentioned there, Rafe mentioned there, one of the archetypes of England is the church, with the England flag, in a little village or whatever. Something very strange happened this Easter, didn't it? Or should I say strange in the context of our times, which is that there was a considerable surge in attendance at churches. But this is not just the whole story, is it, actually?
No, well, it's a rather complex sociological affair, and any generalization made about it is bound thereby to be false. However, it is interesting that, so just to give people a rough idea of what we're talking about, it's particularly pronounced among young men, this desire to get back to church. The evidence is that this Easter, as opposed to previous Easters, there was more than a five-fold increase in attendance at church by young men in this country, which and many people are speaking in terms of is this the beginning of a Christian revival? And it's the sort of thing that, if true, would be very, very surprising, given that in the 2000s and in the 2010s, what was very, very popular among young men was more kind of casual Reddit atheism, fed by people like Richard Dawkins, people like Christopher Hitchens, people like Sam Harris, people like Daniel Dennett. These people were called the four horsemen of new atheism, and they weren't actually very sophisticated philosophers, either of them, but nevertheless they were indicative of a cultural trend that was becoming popularized, that had previously been much more sophisticated in analytic philosophy in the post-war era, people like Bertrand Russell and people like A.J. Ayer. And you can see these people as a kind of cultural expression of that kind of thinking. So you might have thought that that secularization would proceed and continue apace in Britain, and that we would become a more secular country, a more liberal country, a more enlightened country, and all the rest of it. And I think partly as a result of the fact that that hasn't happened, and people are feeling a serious crisis of meaning, suicide rates are up, the number of people in Western democracies who, when asked the question, does my life mean anything, do I have any purpose, has been consistently going down. It's no wonder that people young men in particular, are beginning to reach for these much stronger, thicker forms of identity, which don't just tell you that you're free to do... Thicker in the sense that they're not not thin reeds to hold on to, but
I've heard this terminology before.
Oh, okay, right, yes, it's quite common in philosophy to talk about that's a strong claim or a weak claim or a thin claim or a thick claim, but yes, so claim to a thicker form of identity, which doesn't just say, look, you're free to do whatever you want, so long as it's within the bounds of the law, but actually makes a strong claim on you and says, look, you are this, you are a creature of God, you have duties to perform as well as powers to exercise. And so this can be actually very meaningful to people. So it's like someone like Jordan Peterson so much as saying you should wake up early and tidy your room and make sure that you work hard. All of a sudden, this is just revolutionary advice to people, because rather than being told they can do what they want, they're actually being told to do something. They're being given something more than liberty. They're being given order and authority, which has been lacking. And I also think as well that so there are all of these sort of autochthonous trends that have a lot to do with modernity and Western civilization. Another reason why I think that church attendance is likely to be up among young men in particular is because there's a sense that there is a rival challenge to our civilization, most salient in the form of Islam, which makes no bones whatsoever about making those strong claims about man and his relationship to God, and is having immense social consequences in our society. So in many ways, I think the fact that that church attendance is up among young men can be, and young people in general, but particularly among young men, can be viewed as an immune response to a very serious civilizational challenge, which, if allowed to win, will make any form of Christian life completely impossible in the West, just as indeed Christian life is very, very difficult in North Africa and the Middle East, where Islam is demographically dominant.
I did see this sort of new, because of course there are a couple of other elements. We had it at Easter, but generally church attendance has been going up by how much did you say?
Well, I saw figures which said that it had gone up fivefold.
About five.
But to be clear, when I say we're talking about going from 4% to 22%. It's not like 20% to 100%, but it was a significant social trend nonetheless.
I think that was for men fivefold.
Yes, I think so.
It's 12% in general for church.
Yes, that's right.
Church attendance.
That's right.
To me, I did see this immediately quite politically.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, in relation to what we've just been talking about with England, I thought it happens in the strangest ways. People sort of would not expect it to happen in that way necessarily.
And it should also be worth saying that the sort of churches that these men are attending are the more orthodox churches, so kind of the ones with the stronger sense of faith, like the Catholic Church or Pentecostal Church or High Anglican, not the more progressive, kind of wishy-washy liberal churches.
Church of England.
Yeah, and I think it's because, particularly of young men, in that the more orthodox churches, they are quite patriarchal. I would say it's a benevolent form of patriarchy. But, the Catholic Church, the leaders are all men. And we live in a society now where men don't have many role models. A lot of them are growing up without fathers. The society hates men. We just had that adolescence. Yeah. And, we just had this sentencing guidelines that almost make we're going to treat Christian men differently or unfairly in our legal system. And there is something about Christianity, a lot of the stories are about men going on adventures and how a man can lead a good life. And there's lots of, role models in the Catholic Church and theologians and that kind of thing. So I think it is it's speaking to men in that way. I do think Jordan Peterson is quite pivotal in that as well. And I think possibly with Gen Z as well, which is 18 to 25-year-olds, they've almost been raised. I think the new atheists, there was this idea of people being raised with Christianity and being taught it in school and then rebelling, saying, why was I taught all this nonsense? But I think Gen Z probably weren't even taught it in schools, that they didn't have the experience of being taught the Bible stories. And they get to a certain age and they think, well, why wasn't I told about my culture? Why wasn't I shown this? And so there isn't that kind of rebellion. It's more it's a rebellion to go to church. It's kind of now countercultural. So you feel like you're being involved in something that's kicking back, particularly in relation to the growth of Islam. But I also think it's just, as I would say, a rebellion against the culture in general.
Yes. It definitely had that feeling about it for me. Did you sort of feel any different over Easter? Did you see any evidence of this? Or are we talking about, by the way, urban areas as well as on non-urban areas, or what?
Well, I'm Catholic, and it's undeniable Catholic churches are fuller now than they ever have been. And in fact, we're just at the point, or we may have just passed the point, where there are more Catholic church attendances than there are Anglican church attendances. And I think that speaks to the bigger issue here. Because, look, yes, it's absolutely wonderful that the churches are overfilling. It's hugely encouraging. And hopefully that will grow, but we are still talking about a tiny proportion of the population. The last census in 2021 showed that for the first time ever, Christians were a minority religion in this country. And that wasn't because of other religions coming, that was because people were no longer identifying. So we had people who were ancestrally Anglican, who were choosing no longer to identify as Anglican. So there is a completely dramatic decline in church attendance by the Anglican, by the indigenous population of this country. And who is filling up the pews? Well, it's people from Central and Eastern Europe in terms of Poles and others. And it's also people from Africa who are coming here, who are Catholic, who are evangelicals, Pentecostals, Baptists, and so forth. So we still don't get away from the actual core issue here, which is the decline of the Church of England and the decline of religious attendance by the indigenous population of this country. Yes, you do have a resurgence amongst some young men, but as we know, looking at the last election, the number of men who voted for the Reform Party was more than the Conservative Party, but it was still it wasn't even in double digits. We're still in single digits. We still have the most radically left-wing youth in the country, and we don't see any real dent in that. Although, of course, those people who watch this channel and those who share our views, of course, we are feeling as if we're becoming an oppressed, persecuted minority. Our country's being taken away from us. So it's only inevitable that we would flock back to the churches to find that degree of belonging somewhere and of belief in something else and tradition. And that's, of course, why the religions that are succeeding are the more orthodox ones, those that stand for something, be it the Catholicism or the Orthodox faith, or indeed be it Islam, compared to Anglicanism, which is trying to be all things to all people, and there's nothing for nobody.
You see, I don't like, you talk about Poles or people from Africa, evangelical Christians, whatever. I sort of don't mind so long as they're standing up against Islam. That's my view, straight up, And in fact, interestingly, where I live in Windsor, you've got your kind of, you've got, St. George's Chapel across the road, right? Very sort of staid and very sort of solemn. But then just not that far along the street, there is the theatre. And on a Sunday, that is absolutely packed to the rafters. Very multi-ethnic crowd, evangelical Christian. And it is, I think probably far better attended than St. George's, actually.
Oh, sure.
So, but I sort of don't mind, in a way, within reason.
My point is still a symptom of mass immigration, is most my point.
Yes, absolutely. But it's interesting, do you know there's a novel called Children of Men by P.D. James? It was made into quite a good film. And it's all about the fact that people no longer are actually, reproducing. It's lost the ability to reproduce. But one of the sort of small ways in which this first becomes evident is that midwives notice suddenly that they no longer have any appointments after a certain amount of time. And this is how I see this. these little sort of ways around that we shouldn't ignore, that might be the gathering together of some form of a fight back. That
does come attached to a paradox in my view, though, which is that it is true that we want people to have more children in this country because if you as Evan once wrote, Evan, who used to be on my DD program, once wrote in a good essay. He said, "The future belongs to those who show up for it," and we face no future unless we, to some extent, passing on a tradition, and we need to pass it on to somebody. So it's very important that people have children, but the evidence there seems to be something about modernity which militates against childbirth, against natalism, and I think that part of the curse of modernity is that it forces us to think in terms of the calculating reason, these kind of technocratic criteria, pros and cons. And Oswald Spengler once wrote, he said, once people begin to calculate whether or not they're going to have children on the basis of worldly pros and cons, that civilization is dead because nature knows nothing of pros and cons. So I think it's very important that people get back into Christianity for the right reasons, not because they're making these sorts of pragmatic calculations, and then the fruits will follow. But I don't think that it's possible to sustain a Christian church, like a properly Christian church nation that is passing on that tradition, if people are only flocking to Christianity because they see it as an instrument for having more children.
Well, you raised another interesting point, which is rather tangential, but we've seen in recent months and years some very high-profile figures on the right very publicly converting to Christianity or converting to Catholicism. People like Candace Owen and others have gone through this. And I'm afraid I can't help but be a tad cynical about many of those conversions, which are done so publicly, wondering, well, do you actually believe in the resurrection? Do you actually believe, as a Catholic, in transubstantiation? Do you actually believe that the bread and the wine does become the body and blood of Christ? Do you believe in the Immaculate Conception? And if you don't believe in those, well, this isn't a real, genuine conversion. And you aren't a true believer in the faith. And so I wonder how much of this is actually performative, because it does tie in politically to the shift to a more orthodox cultural belief in nation and flag faith in the nation. And so I do think those are issues which I don't see many people discussing.
Hasn't Russell Brand done?
Russell Brand probably saying much that may well apply. Who knows? It's not my place to question somebody's faith. I should also say, it's up to them generally. But I do have some doubts about some people, without naming names.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think Russell Brand's one of the worst examples. He kind of had all these allegations against him, and then suddenly found God and has totally switched. He was a kind of revolutionary socialist at one point, and it feels very, I mean, as you say, you don't know what's going on in his heart and what he genuinely thinks, but it feels very commercialised. It's very much part of his kind of package of, getting clicks and likes and getting the right people on side. It feels to me very calculated, but that's how it looks.
Maybe this is too big a subject for maybe for another programme, but do you think you can decide to believe? I mean, the reason I'm saying that, you say, that he's found God. The implication for me is always that there is a spontaneity about this in some way. Can one actually make the decision? That's it. I'm going to start believing.
I think.
Is it possible?
I think it depends on the degrees of plausibility that can be assigned to the truth claim. So that can be assigned to the belief. And so if you have, for example, if I were to offer you, I could offer you all of the money in the world to believe that the world is flat. And that financial inducement to believe that the world is flat might be able to get you to say that you believe the world is flat, but it wouldn't really alter your epistemic view of the world. So your beliefs wouldn't actually be altered. But so because we're dealing about a fairly clear-cut case here where we believe, and we think we have good reason to believe that the Earth isn't flat. When it comes to metaphysical claims, I think reason can get you only to a certain point, because it can't really be litigated in the end on this side of heaven. But once it gets you to that point, I think you probably can motivate yourself to make that leap of faith, and you can decide to make the leap of faith. But I think it depends on where you already are epistemically. I don't think you can just start from nowhere and be induced with some kind of civilizational inducement or a financial inducement to believe a certain thing. So I don't think it's a matter of pure decision.
What about Pascal's wager then?
Yes, but he tries to he builds up to that is the point, and you need to build up to a position where all of a sudden you can get pragmatic reasons that encroach on epistemic criteria.
Well, one of the pragmatic reasons might be nothing to do with money, just simply that you are concerned about what is happening, and you want to do more than just sort of supporting this flying buttress way of Churchill's, outside. You want to do something. So I think people can actually decide, can't they?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a kind of a cultural Christianity, whereas I think the subject of belief, to me, it's always quite private, which is why I am quite cynical about people like Russell Brand who come out and just express how they have this strong belief suddenly. Like, belief to me is quite difficult to articulate. It kind of waxes and wanes. Jordan Peterson talks about kind of wrestling with God, that you have ups and downs. You have moments that are very intimate where you feel certain things that you can't explain. To me, it feels very difficult to then package that and say, this is what I think or feel, because it's just so abstract and complicated. So to me, genuine belief is quite, to me, it's a very private thing. So it's quite difficult to explain it to people.
I think you can have those feelings. I think, and you can obviously but it sort of comes down for me to what Rafe mentioned earlier about transubstantiation, and belief in that. You've got to do it, haven't you? You've got to believe in it.
Not as a Catholic, not as an Anglican, but if you're like Candace Owen, if you're subscribing to the Catholic faith, you have to believe in the Immaculate Conception, in transubstantiation, in the resurrection. Those are central core tenets of the faith. And if you don't believe in the resurrection, well, then you'd be an Anglican bishop, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. Yes, but I think we're going to return to this because I think it is a growing phenomenon, definitely. But in the meantime, the bread and butter of our show, Rafe, Reform have changed their tune, apparently, on remigration or deportation, should I say.
That's right. Well, we've all been desperately waiting for Reform to come out with some immigration policy. Hitherto, all that we've had have been the occasional interview that Nigel Farage has given, and so we've been given, different pieces of information, sometimes quite contradictory from one podcast to another. Farage said that he didn't think mass deportations were plausible or possible. Now, of course, we've had an official platform policy launch in which he has said that Reform UK wants to create a Minister of Deportations, which, of course, sounds very encouraging. And this would be incorporated into the Home Office, which sounds less encouraging, but it comes on the back of an understanding from Reform UK that the Home Office is broken. As we've said here, they are a fifth column in many ways, working against the interests of the British nation, and therefore you need to have a proper reform of the Home Office and also ensure that those people running this Ministry of Deportation are actually very sound individuals who are capable and willing to actually take that task ahead. He's also said that he's committed to Reform UK taking Britain out of the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and also, crucially, repealing the Human Rights Act, of course, which is one of the reasons you have so many crazy verdicts about people's right to stay in this country, even though they've obviously worked to make themselves completely anathema to British life. So we just have to see essentially what's going to come. We have another 3 or 4 weeks' time, they're going to come out with even more policy and more detail on some of this to flesh it out. But on the face of it, I think it sounds much more encouraging than we've had before. And it's what I was told privately behind the scenes by people in Reform who said, just wait, we are coming out with real policies and they are going to be stuff that you will approve of. Yeah,
the thing is that with this sort of, hurry up and wait thing, is that I can't quite see what the secret is, because essentially this is vote-winning stuff, is it not?
I guess the timing is significant now in that there is a by-election on the 1st of May in Runcorn. It's quite a significant by-election just generally, but it's one that Reform could potentially win, and Runcorn is affected by immigration. I mean, Matt Goodwin's done some good stuff on this. He was showing how there are a lot of hotels that are being taken up by asylum seekers, a lot of people complaining about the crime, and houses being used as hostels for kind of drugs and prostitution, and it's affecting the community. So this coming out with this statement now might, pushes the topic into the media, and it might be the thing that swings voters in Runcorn. So maybe he's done it strategically in that sense.
What are we talking about, by the way? Are we talking about, because this was the problem before, the confusion in the wording that was used, are we talking about all illegal migrants?
That's certainly the logic of his claim, yes, because he says at one point in this speech that ultimately that is our ambition, is what he said. He said ultimately our ambition is to make sure that no illegal immigrant to have come into the country is allowed to stay. And of course, most people, when they think of illegal immigrants at the moment, think of the small boats problem and think of the way that has been building up since 2017 in particular. But of course, there are quite a lot of people who've overstayed on visas who've been able to do so, and have even been able to go home and then come back again because Tony Blair got rid of exit checks. There are a lot of other forms of illegal immigration that predate 2017 that would also, on this principle of getting rid of all of them, would have to be pursued. I suppose he would do something like what Trump is trying to do in the United States. He would have a sort of it would be there would be a kind of a triage of priorities about which immigrants to go after first, and presumably he'd start with the ones who'd come in since 2017 because they're most salient in the public mind. But yeah, actually, I should have thought it was a vote winner, not least because immigration could hardly be more salient in the public mind. Barely a day goes by where there is not some casualty of diversity, whether it's a stabbing attack, whether it's a machete fight, whether it's sort of like third world habits being reproduced in Birmingham, as illustrated by the fact that the streets were just lined with rubbish.
Also, what we're going to have actually soon, possibly, are repercussions from what's been happening in India, Pakistan.
Yeah. Certainly,
where will that happen?
Yeah, an ethnic conflict that has nothing to do with us, whether it's Eritreans and Ethiopians fighting it out on the street of London, or Pakistanis and Indians doing so on the streets of Leicester. This is something that no patriotic prime minister should want to import tribal blood feuds from thousands of miles away into our country. And this is just a natural consequence of mass immigration. It's not something that can be avoided by making happy clappy speeches about our shared values.
It's worth noting, of course, that he never uttered the words mass deportation at any point in this, and I don't think you're going to see that particular combination of words used, because, of course, the reason that Reform Party is doing so well in the polls, above the Conservatives, possibly above Labour already in the polls, is because they've watered down their message in many ways. And I think they were trying to figure out how to come up with this policy without alienating, as they see it. I don't think they would be alienating the mainstream part of British society, but they saw it that way, which is why they've used, I think, the term a minister of deportations rather than saying mass deportations. But currently what they've said is that only foreign criminals are going to be deported in the short term of a new government. Now, we would say anyone who's an illegal immigrant is a foreign criminal. But that's not what they're saying. If you have a criminal conviction, then you'll be deported. And ultimately, in the fullness of time, as Sir Humphrey might have said from the Westminster, we will hopefully be able to deport all illegal immigrants, but that depends on their ability to get rid of the obstacle, which is the Home Office, and that's fundamental. They've also said they're going to stop that if you are here on a student visa or anything like that, you won't be able to apply for asylum. So they're getting rid of that. I personally think they should just say we need to get rid of the UN Convention on Refugees.
Exactly.
If you're not, you should stay within your continent of origin. That would be a bold policy decision. Try and easily get the Dutch on that and side, maybe even the Germans and others. Who knows? The Americans currently, if you're Ukrainian, yes, come to Europe. But if you're fleeing Sudan, you go elsewhere in Africa. If you're fleeing Vietnam, you go elsewhere in Asia. There's, cultural compatibility must be the key thing, and I think that they're losing a trick on that. So there's a lot there. We'll have to see what happens in 3 or 4 weeks. Hopefully some reform policy advisors do watch Newspeak, and some of these policies may appear in 3 or 4 weeks. So you heard it here first.
Oh, yes. Interesting, actually, before we get to that, we've got these elections next week, next Thursday. And I suppose what happens with reform is going to be kind of crucial in a way. We've got a by-election in Runcorn, and then we've got these local elections. You mentioned polls. I think the most recent one, Matthew Goodwin, is terribly reliable. He always puts the polls up. And I think Reform is way above both of the other parties.
Yeah, significantly so. I think the largest amount that they've been so far, I think it's 28%, and Labour and Tories are quite significantly below, like neck and neck. So yeah, I mean, they're doing very well.
But I think no one's breaking 30, are they, anymore?
No, not yet, no.
And you need 32. 32 is you can get a slim path to a majority government with 32. Labour has 33% of the vote, and it got a stonking majority. So there is a pathway to victory for reform. I should just say the last thing, though, is he's still committed to this net zero immigration policy, essentially, which means that the population of this country won't be allowed to rise through net immigration, which, of course, still ends up having the replacement of the population.
Well, yes, massive cultural change. Doesn't change. Doesn't alter that. What we'll probably next time on the next week's show we will discuss this. Maybe record it a bit later, actually, and so we can discuss the elections. We're going to actually carry on talking about the response, the crazy response to the Supreme Court's ruling on women, actually. So if you would like to hear that, and indeed when we do carry on every week, please do become a member, won't you? That way you can do it, and you could be helping us too. Very, very important. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Rafe. Thank you very much, Amy and Harrison, and we shall see you next week. Bye-bye. Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns